We launched this sustainability lecture and dialogue series last fall to feature UNCG researchers whose work address aspects of sustainability and to have dialogue around them. So this is the first event of this semester and the sixth one since we started. Most of the past recordings are available on the Office of Sustainability website, so please check them out. Every event, we focus on a theme. Today's theme is climate justice. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers who have been working to address this planetary challenge for many years. The first presentation today is by Dr. Meredith Powers and Ms. Alicia LeeCee Jones. Dr. Powers is an assistant professor of social work. She has co-authored and co-edited a growing body of work on climate justice and the eco-social worldview. She's the founder and director of International Federation of Social Workers Climate Justice Program. Ms. Jones is a passionate advocate and activist. She collaborates with Dr. Powers on a number of projects, including Climates of Inequality, Stories of Environmental Justice. This was a national collaboration with Rutgers University's Humanities Action Lab. Today, Dr. Powers and Ms. Jones will share their collaborations on climate justice literacy, including their recent endeavors writing children's books and launching the nonprofit called Implementing Diverse Equitable Accessible Literacy Lead. Our second speaker is Dr. Stephen Knoll-Smith. He's a professor of sociology. He has done extensive work in environmental sociology, particularly addressing the relationship between natural disasters and inequality. His most recent award-winning book is entitled Recovering Inequality, Hurricane Katrina and the San Francisco Earthquake of 1906 and the Aftermath of Disaster. This is a fascinating comparison and analysis of the two major disasters a century apart. I highly recommend that you check it out. If you're a UNCG member, you can read it as an ebook. His talk today is titled The Long Goodbye, Adapting to a Disappearing Ancestral Island, the story of Isle de Jean Charles. Please join me in welcoming the speakers.
Hi, thank you so much for the great introduction, the warm welcome. I am Lisi, going by Lisi today, that's my nickname, but my government is Alicia Jones, and I'm just very thrilled to be here today. And I'm with my colleague, Dr. Powers, and we are going to be speaking with you an overview of climate justice literacy today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And yes, I'm Meredith Powers. So looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about climate justice literacy with my colleague, Lisi. Let me go ahead and share the screen. Okay, there we are. You see that, Lisi? We're good?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So like we mentioned, we're going to be speaking with you a little bit about various terminology that has been going around climate change as well as environmental injustices. And we're specifically going to be talking to you about climate justice literacy today.
All right, and before we get into the presentation, we want to pause for a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous and First Nations peoples worldwide whose lands, wind, and waters we now all share. And we would like to pay respect to their beliefs and values and their continuing and enduring cultures, which deepen and enrich the life of our global community. And UNC Greensboro is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. And we acknowledge that the land we gather on has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous peoples, specifically the Kiawe and Saura.
And our agenda is as follows. We're going to speak to you about the Climates of Equality project. That is a ongoing project, and the overview of concepts, eco-social worldview, climate justice, environmental racism, climate justice literacy, and then the debut of the Ideal League, an overview of it, and then the climate justice literacy layer.
Sounds like a robust agenda, but we're going to try to speed through it and then have time at the end for questions.
Okay, so this marriage of ours, I was able to, 2019, meet Dr. Powers, but we've been collaborating on a project that is out of Rutgers University in New Jersey, the Humanities Actions Lab. And this is a travel exhibit that is going to be ongoing for a couple of years now. And it's going to travel to about 23 cities globally. And so the stories of environmental justice is basically community-based participatory action research project, like I said, that is national as well as global. And I contributed based on my extensive work in the town of Princeville because it's a known, now gaining more awareness of the historical landmark and legacy that it was the first U.S. Town incorporated by people who have been enslaved. And the town of Princeville is committed to rebuilding its history and preserving its history through going through several hurricanes and flooding caused by global environmental change and environmental injustice. And so with that said, of course, we're in the month of February. I would like to extend all gratitude to my following people as well as my ancestors that have contributed to a lot here in America. And also with the environmental injustices is covering so many layers, but hopefully we'll be able to touch one of those layers today in regards to literacy. And Dr. Powers specifically contributed based on her work with immigrants and refugees, examining how climate change created push factors for migration as well as environmental benefits and injustices faced upon resettlement in Greensboro. And one of our commonalities that we merged together is the fact that both areas, Princeville as well as the area in Greensboro, there was a lot of displacement going on with the residents from my end on Princeville as well as Greensboro. And so with that commonality, we also found that that was one of the environmental injustices that was going on across the whole project.
Yes, thanks. And also we were participating with Dr. Steve Curl-Smith, who's our co-presenter today on this lecture series. And we're thankful for all that we learned from him and being able to participate in that with him on this project that is still going on. So we'll share more about that in a different presentation, but that's just how we came together. So we wanted to give you a little background of how we got to this point and coming together on climate justice literacy specifically. So before we really jump into climate justice literacy, we need to start with a little bit of a broader standpoint. So we have a few terms to define for you. Please indulge us if you already understand these terms, but we wanted to make sure everybody follows along with the conversation just in case these terms are unfamiliar. So the idea of an eco-social worldview is something that I didn't actually grow up in this, my culture of origin did not promote an eco-social worldview. It was much more of a human-centered or anthropocentric worldview. It wasn't until I came into a master's program in social work and took a course on sustainability that I even realized that I was so situated in an anthropocentric worldview that I didn't know that there was such a thing as an eco-social worldview. So I really connected with it at that point, started learning more about it tremendously over the years from different colleagues and scholars, present and historical. And really the idea is that the eco-social worldview sees the interconnectedness of all life in our ecosystem, and that it promotes the fair and sustainable use of resources that enhance the relationships, and really doesn't see things so much as resources as reciprocal, reciprocity and relationships. For mutual well-being of all within the ecosystem, and that humans are just one species within this ecosystem. It causes us to critically examine and question the modern societal structures, values, and beliefs and practices and ways of life that lead to climate injustice, such as overconsumption, materialism, again, that human-centeredness or thinking of humans as being outside of or over other species or over the environment, and the oppression and exploitation of both people and planet. If you'd like to go a little bit deeper, learning about worldview and seeing sort of where you are in this array of different worldviews, some of my colleagues contributed a chapter to a volume of a workbook series that I co-edited. It's free for you to download the whole book. In fact, the whole workbook series is free, but this one chapter is just so phenomenal. And it even gives you some, not just background on what worldviews are, but a couple of tools, application tools that you could use in a classroom setting with your students or for yourself. And it looks at a little quiz a little bit. I asked you some questions and you can determine sort of where you fall in this array of worldviews. So this one is developing critical self-awareness to incorporate sustainability into worldviews. So I encourage you to check out that resource, and I have the link there for you. So climate justice, environmental justice, and the climate crisis. Sometimes people get a little confused on some terms such as the climate justice or environmental justice. And so I really like to break it down for people to understand that climate justice, sometimes understood as ecological justice, is really this much broader umbrella. It means justice for the entire ecosystem, for all species, and that humans, again, are just one piece of that. Environmental justice is really much more specific to the human component, the justices or injustices that are created related to environmental degradation or climate change that impacts humans as a species specifically. And a lot of times this is also connected to environmental racism and gender inequalities. The climate crisis, we just wanted to make sure that people understand, is not just some act of nature that climate change is happening. While that is true and that does take place, the climate crisis is actually connected to the human activities and how we are exacerbating climate change and creating greater climate catastrophes and environmental degradation. So that really is impacting others. So the way that we behave individually, corporately, as nations, all of the different entities and the different levels really can contribute to things such as desertification, flooding, habitat and species loss, a lot of the disastrous weather patterns that create issues that then cause people to have to migrate, for instance, some of the research that Ms. Jones was speaking about me doing earlier with the students on refugee work. So again, focusing on environmental racism, that is the injustices done based on race. And so a lot of these have to do with the lack of the benefits of the natural environment, whether that's just having access to certain natural environments for your own benefit of ecotherapy and connecting with nature and seeing yourself, again, from that ecosocial perspective as part of nature. But also having more of the burdens of those environmental hazards. And that the lack of climate justice literacy is actually one component when thinking about environmental injustices, that the education and the resources may not be made available to help people realize that there's a severity of these hazards that might be coming their way, like the flooding that was about to happen in Princeville, and people maybe were unaware because they didn't have climate justice literacy on how to prepare for that or to mitigate the disaster, and maybe to evacuate and or receive the recovery resources from the government. That a lot of that was due to environmental racism. They were not prioritized as needing the resources to recover from some of those disasters. Some of the other examples that we thought about were here in Greensboro with the North Buffalo Creek community, down in New Orleans with Gordon Plaza, and in Duplin County, related to the pig farming, the hog farms and the waste industry there. So climate justice literacy, we were thinking about what does literacy mean? And sometimes people think of it as just reading and writing, but that's a pretty narrow understanding of literacy. And what we were discussing together is that literacy is much more broadly understood these days. It includes competence around knowledge in a specific area. That might be food literacy, A lot of people in this call, I saw a few colleagues that are working on food literacy. It could be music literacy or technology. So that under that broad understanding of literacy, we situate climate justice literacy. We think of it as needing to come from an eco-social worldview, and that it's very contextual. So being climate literate may be very different in an urban situation versus in a rural situation. So maybe you are not literate in poisonous plants as you walk around a natural habitat, versus if you were, living in that area and becoming literate in that might be something that you really need more than other aspects of literacy. You might know how to construct or build cob houses or adobe huts, whatever the case may be, using natural materials. So, and this also values many ways of knowing and understanding. For instance, indigenous knowledges, oral histories, lots of different ways to disseminate knowledge and to help people be literate versus just prioritizing some of the what has become standard, but really has become, a colonialist style of prioritizing certain ways of dissemination, like a peer-reviewed scholarly journal over other forms of dissemination. So climate justice literacy really works in those different areas. These examples of the books that you see here, the books are The Wump World. That was actually a children's book that impacted me greatly from kindergarten on. And I really think it may have been part of what set me on the trajectory of the life that I'm leading now in my career and in my own, personal life, thinking about climate justice. It's perhaps if some people had seen the Lorax, the Dr. Seuss book, that one might have resonated with you. It's somewhat similar, but The Wump World by Bill Peet came out back in the 70s and was certainly instrumental for me in creating climate justice literacy for me at a young early age. Braiding Sweetgrass is another absolutely fantastic book that I have come to love and have it as an audiobook and listen to it over and over and recommend it to everyone. It's by an Indigenous scholar, Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she's up in the northern United States, I believe in New York area. So it's called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. And she, through this book, shows her journey in a very personal way of becoming a professor, I believe, of biology and specifically looking at plants, and how her own indigenous wisdom was not necessarily valued in the university institution when she was being taught scientific knowledge, but how she came back and reclaimed that and was able to merge the two, and also to learn from the actual teaching of plants, seeing how nature would be her instrument to teach her, to give her that wisdom. And then just another one, as a side note, I haven't actually had much experience with it myself, other than I'm aware of it, The Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. So again, this is a very interesting concept that we have taken children out of the woods, tried to put them in classrooms and teach them formal education. And we've even designated the rights of the child from the UN, all these different things. And yet we're creating deficits in other ways, in other forms of literacy. And now I'll turn it over to Ms. Jones to talk about the Appeal League.
Thank you. So with that said, how she mentioned things that brought her into her status now personally. So personally, if you can just take a moment or two to just think about what was your favorite childhood book, just reflecting upon that. Those personal experiences for me as a child, I was always an avid reader, loved book fairs and also going to the school library. But I also remember that most of my literature was formally conditioned as being white. And I didn't really notice too many things about, a reflection of me in a book, even if it was about a goldfish or going down the street riding my bike, the book did not resemble me. And I read a lot of great books back in the day, and even to this day, but the push and the promotion, as well as having it a focal point, even on recommended lists that are given out to teachers, to the parents, for the kids to take home, and you have to read several number of books in order to get a credit. And also in grade school, I remember just reading specific literature that I actually had to study in order to get a grade on a standardized test. All of those things I just reflected upon, and then going through mentoring programs as well as just community-based programs that are youth-oriented, I started to realize that this gap that I experienced several years ago in my childhood is still here. It has been brushed or underneath the rug a lot, and yes, there are tremendous amounts of books out there that are diverse, but then some categories are lacking that knowledge, such as climate literacy right now, climate justice literacy. And so the birth of the IDEAL League, it stands for Implementing Diverse Equitable Accessible Literacy. The mission is to provide these equitable access to inclusive literacy materials and educational activities that affirm, advocate for, and empower youth. I think that with that being said, it just wraps it up in a bubble that this is an intervention that we want to actually be a change agency. Because also, I don't know, going back to childhood, the Justice League was very popular. And, as the IDEAL League, we want to be the actual change agents, like we are, grassroots, field workers in the communities, as well as researchers and scholars. We want to actually give this a boost to actually get towards the youth, the future, the generation that needs to learn from, literacy as well as understanding and the knowledge of the worldview. So for the core objectives, from an equal social worldview, tackle the educational gap and achievement gap by providing positive exposure to differences at an early age through literacy, focusing on various branches of diversity, race, ethnicity, color, and family dynamics and culture, including like religion, spirituality, language, and the location where people are growing up. Mental and physical differing abilities, and that speaks for itself, and then gender identities and sexuality. These are the categories that we want to actually focus on, and as we go and research, we're probably going to have an expansion of these categories as well. But basically promoting the value of all literacy, even oral history, writing, reading, math, and especially we want to focus on the value of reading. Advocating for children through the distribution of diverse books and educational materials to help continue their path to learning, sharing, and growing to love themselves holistically, embracing others within our ecosystem. So just hearing that holistically is, because at an early age, I know how to adapt to different cultures. I know how to adapt to different locations as well as people, and I understand differences. I feel that, and I believe that if these books are promoted, and there's tons of books out there, but then there's a lack of them as well. If we are able to focus on getting these books into the households, into the school institutions, as well as libraries, then them in fighting against bullying and understanding differences, we'll be able to embrace that versus resist it.
I think you didn't read the fourth one yet. Did you want to touch on that one?
I can't see it.
No. It says lessen the risk of children developing prejudices and reduce, reduce societal issues. Sorry, I'm having some problems here.
Yeah, it cut me off. I'm sorry, I couldn't see the last one.
Okay, yeah. I'll read it again. Sorry, my screen was also messed up. Lessen the risk of children developing prejudices and reduce societal issues of superiority and elitism within themselves, systems, and communities, and lessen and or eradicate the internalizing of oppressive beliefs.
So I mentioned that a little bit in number 3, but basically, fighting against the resistance of the elitism that one may get if you are looking at yourself all day in every forms and mediums of media and as well as literature. If we are able to embrace diverse, inclusive books, literacy in all forms, food literacy, music literacy, technology literacy, all these categories, just to embrace the diversity that America is, as well as the world is, then we will be able to reduce and lessen those risks of prejudices as well as any type of bias that may form. And then also the self-esteem and the confidence of one, knowing their culture, knowing their heritage, knowing their differing abilities, they will be able to also be confident in that as well. So the next slide, we're going to be speaking about why representation matters. In the light of what's going on right now, there's a large momentum that's going on in regards to social justice within itself. So everybody feels that, of course, because COVID has slowed everything down, and a lot of things that once wasn't in our face or that wasn't forced to be in our face because of idleness is now in our face. But for a lot of us, especially being a Black woman, these type of things in regards to representation, I have been dealing with since birth. Culturally, it has been taught to me since birth. And so when you look at the diversity in children's books, we were able to research some statistics. And when children are interested in and can identify with what they read, they make more connections. And having interpersonal skills early on and adaptability skills early on is great for just human nature, human connections, and connecting with people socially and understanding one another. And that will lead to just loving yourself and another person. And this also boosts the brain's development and ability to learn. The inclusion of positive representation of diverse groups allows people to not merely feel represented, but also connects them to the value of the content and the enhanced beliefs that they can also be the change agents. So when I see, for instance, when I see Cicely Tyson, rest in peace, at a young age, that to me was very honoring, very inspiring. And so seeing that also presented in books, math books, reading books, books about riding a bike, those type of things, if you connect and mirror the reflection of yourself, it also can increase the self-esteem and the self-confidence, and one's embracing the love for themselves, and as well as self-care at an early age will also lead to the value of us being our own change agents to make the world a better place. So that's where all of that comes in at the positive representation. There's a lack of it in so many layers, and so that's why representation matters. And as you look at this chart, as visually, the percentages are astounding. However, they are real. 27% of books are written for animals, or you see animals in a book. And then as you look at several other the races and groups and nationalities, they come after the animals. That speaks for itself in regards to social economic disparities. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so the essence of the Ideal League, the literacy gap is not just about the content of being available and accessible, which is very important. It's especially about the delivery of the content through materials that are inclusive of diversity. So when I speak and give examples of, seeing, an Asian young girl or young boy riding a bike, a normal story, versus it having to be about social justice or race or anything like that. It's just a normal story, normal everyday in the climate, in your environment story. if we deliver this content in a positive light, that research is necessary in order for us to actually open these avenues for us to fill in these gaps in literacy, opportunity gap, educational gap, achievement gap. All of these are interconnected in some form or fashion in order for all of us to be more productive and making a change in this world. And so the content of researching and curating existing literacy resources and programs, like there's summer camps, as well as the recommended reading lists that are already distributed in the school systems. And there are also webinars that are already out there. It's just, are they accessible and are they available? And then when they are accessible and available, who is vetting these resources? Like I said, from personally, I had a lot of great books, a lot of literature, and I can think back to the standardized test that I had to figure out about William Shakespeare. That's embedded in me. That was formally conditioned in me. So if we are able to do that, then we are also able to be more inclusive as well in the school system. Also create new materials, research resources and programs, as well as puzzles, posters that you see in classrooms, flashcards that you use. All of those things will help fill in the gaps that we need in order to meet different inventories of how people learn and how kids learn. There's different themes and there's different content topics that we can focus on that we can actually fill in these representation gaps. In the delivery part, I definitely want to mention that these pathways, we also can get together, and that's what we're planning on doing, and creating these existing literacy avenues and make them available to the school systems, to the libraries, as well as to community-based programs that are already existing and already helping and making a difference in the community, making these things more affordable, the access to these literatures and materials to be accessible, and actually having the book, be created enough for it to be affordable for the kid and the child to bring it back home and build their own household library of books and literature. Create new materials. I can't see the rest, Meredith.
Yeah, as needed to fill the gaps in the literature, and that gap might either be content related or the representation gaps.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, and I know we're running short on time so that we can offer on the floor to Dr. Steve Pearl-Smith, but we have one last slide that's sort of the essence of this. So, okay, do you want to do this one, Lisi?
Okay, so basically, what is actually existing out there right now for the climate justice layer? What gaps do we need to fill? Like, for instance, the how-to of things that has been lost in literacy, like waste management, food growth. As you see this beautiful picture of a tomato, growing, that oral history that my mom, my aunt, my father, they knew how to have the garden in the back of our home and grow food, but that has been lost for me. I have to go to the library, get a book around food growth and gardening in order to implement that for my own self. But natural remedies and health, those things that are lost, that are now very important for us to actually focus on. And then also the eco-social worldview, the why. Why should we care? Why should we value these things, people, the species, everything in our ecosystem? How can we ensure multiple perspectives and ways of knowing that are honored and valued? The indigenous knowledge and oral history, who is represented or excluded in these materials, programs that are results in their disconnection from the climate justice, and how we can ensure equitable access, affordability, and availability. Fears and phobias are transitioned into different generations, from generations before me to generations now. Those type of fears can easily get passed on to the next generation. And that's what we're speaking about, that, yeah, we don't have really time to have a personal story, but culturally, fears are transitioned down into different generations. And so that oral history is what we're speaking about, that we want to actually implement in climate justice, which is one layer of the piece of ideal we'll be working on. Okay.
And then we have contact information for folks who want to follow up with us later.
Yes. So thank you. That is our contact information, and that is a quick overview. I'm sorry for us running a little over time, but we definitely am welcoming any questions either now or through email and phone. And we appreciate your time and listening today.
Thank you, Meredith and Lisi. Steve, if we want to just keep on rolling, we'll answer questions at the end.
Let's see. Okay, assuming you can hear me, this will be a comparatively short presentation, and it's based on some work that I did in consulting with researchers, an array of researchers from an array of disciplines who are trying to get their good minds around the human consequences of the displacement of folks that have lived on Île-de-Jean-Charles for generations now. And just talk a little bit about that, and then talk about the, if you will, the social psychology of displacement. And again, I'll keep this relatively brief. If you know anything at all about Louisiana, you probably know that the many parishes that sit parallel to New Orleans and south to the Gulf are marshy in all kinds of ways. They're wetlands. And the amount of wetland loss in that ecological area is extraordinary. In some ways, like Shishmaref in Alaska, this part of Louisiana is ground zero for climate change. And you can see the numbers there with regard to the loss of land. Again, it sits right around sea level, maybe 2 or 3 feet above, but you could actually walk it at one time. And perhaps pirogue, your boat, take that with you and paddle along when you needed to, but you could walk it at one time. And we're seeing that vanish as we speak. Now, what we know is that climate change is going to require what is euphemistically called a managed retreat. And by managed, the idea is that it's well thought out, it's well executed, and that it respects the people that are being displaced. What anthropologists Tony Oliver Smith and others have pointed out is that never happens. And one of the residents of Île-de-Jean-Charles told us in a conversation, Mr. Brunet says, a perfect model for resettlement will be almost impossible because it will always depend on who is speaking and who is listening, with the attitudes, understandings, and histories that they bring to the conversation. And indeed, that is true. And we're seeing it play itself out Those words play themselves out in Ile de Jean Charles. And you can see that the island itself, which once was a peninsula, by the way, now it's an island, and pretty soon it's going to be underwater. But it is the first federally funded effort to relocate a community impacted by changing climate. The island itself is made up of primarily indigenous folks. The Biloxi, the Chittimanga, and the Choctaw. And they have over the years intermarried in one way, shape, or form. There are still some tribal boundaries, etc. But it is they have put together a complex and working social and cultural way of life on the island. At one time, Ile de Jean Charles, roughly 22,000 acres. Right now, it's got 320 acres on quote unquote the island. It has one road in and out, one road to the mainland. That road is frequently washed over in one way, shape, or form. You don't need a major storm in any way, if you will, shape, or form. All you need is a little bit of a rise, a little bit of warming water, and it rises up and spills over the road. And you can see how it is eating away. It's salinated, so it's got some potency to it, and it's eating away what is the only way in and off the island. The relocation is necessary, but it is creating an extraordinary psychological difficulty for lots of people. And so you have this policy making that's going on between Baton Rouge and HUD and the residents, the remaining residents of the island. And it sounds like that would make some sense, and it does. But from the vantage point of the lived experience of the folks that are there, it's really painful to witness, if you will. Yeah. So this same fellow, Mr. Brunet, let's see if they've got that slide. Yeah. So these are a couple outstanding researchers, and they are sitting with Mr. Brunet, and I remember asking him about the loss that he's going through and that his neighbors are going through. And I'm going to read you a quote from that conversation. You know, whenever somebody asks me about that, because for me it is so simple, because I am just so much a part of this, that you're looking for 100 words, then maybe all you got to do is look at it, gestures around, throws his arms around. I mean, that's how I take it. So whenever you ask for me to put into perspective, then you're asking me to put in words. But then all I figure is just look, this here still catches me. It caught me before. It caught me as a child. It caught me as a teenager. It continues to catch me. And then you will say, put it in 100 words. Put it in 100 words. I'm sorry, I can't. So we're all aware of that distinction between space and place. And we're aware of the ways in which place enters us as selves. William James pointed this out, George Herbert Mead pointed this out. We know that not only do we internalize one another, but we also internalize places. Those geographic patches get inside of us, and they literally and figuratively ground this notion of the self. And we also know when we're out of place. We feel it. It's visceral as well as cognitive. These are words from another resident that I spoke with, who was in the process of relocating. My dad's home, this one, the one I was brought up in, was built by his own two hands. You see, that's like a big sentimental value type thing right there. The home was built with his two hands. It may not be the nicest thing anymore, the greatest looking thing. It might be an eyesore now, but I have so many memories. I would not like to see it torn down. Everything here reminds me of my mom and my dad and my brothers and my sisters. So when you have that kind of generational tie and you have that kind of emotive and effective relationship with place in context with family, it's powerful in ways that a lot of us middle-class white folks that move around periodically, more often than not, may not fully grasp. We know that middle class and upper middle class and lower upper class people do tend to move around town to town, part of country to part of country, and so forth. And that mobility, in some way, shape, or form, subtracts from the opportunity to find and develop a deep attachment. But what we're going to be seeing, I think, with respect to climate change, and particularly with respect to climate change in indigenous communities, like we see in Chisholm-Reef, Alaska, we're going to see a different existential response to migration and a different existential response to the task of leaving, the task of walking away from, if you will. So let me just close with a question. How do people remake a self, fashion a new life world when they gaze on some semblance of a house they once knew, on a street or neighborhood they once recognized, but now know only in memory? When the quotidian fabric we once wove together and understood as our typical, our cobbled together interpretive schemes is shredded, we are left with Montaigne's cardinal question, how to live. And I think this question, how to live, is going to be at the forefront, of an increasingly large, growing population of people who, through no fault of their own, are going to be forced to migrate. They're going to be forced to move elsewhere, and they're going to have to deal with that long goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. If you guys want, you can unmute yourselves now and we can start the dialogue and questions. We didn't receive any questions in the chat, If you want to just write to me personally, if you don't want to share anything like a question publicly and remain anonymous, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, feel free to speak up and ask some questions of our guests.
This is a Quaker moment.
I guess I'll ask a question. Those were both great talks. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Steve, I'm wondering, so this is the first resettlement plan of this kind. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little more about what the details of it are and what the perceptions of the local people are to it in terms of whether they feel it's, an equitable solution or any criticisms that they have of it.
I think that the general feeling is that this has been imposed on them, the three tribes, that they haven't had much of a voice in developing the policy going forward. They're more or less told what to do. That's a general feeling. And the other problem is that the land that was purchased to resettle the folks makes no allowances for the ways in which families developed, families in the plural now, developed relationships with one another over time. So what we're hearing from folks that have been relocated is that, I'm living next to somebody that I don't really know, or I'm living next to somebody whose tribal ways of life are not something that I'm all that in sync with. In addition, they have not had much of a say, well, not had really any say in the structure of the houses. They're brick on slab houses, and they don't have that character and feeling that the homes on Ile de Jean Charles had. But my sense is that the folks that have been affected by this are primarily concerned with the fact that they haven't had a voice. They don't feel that they've had enough of a voice in shaping and fashioning this relocation process. And that gets back to that whole question of justice and how justice will take place in these resettlements, or will it?
Hi, I'm just going to ask a question here. So I enjoyed both talks, but this question is directed to Dr. Powers and Miss LeeCee Jones. So Miss LeeCee Jones, as you're going through your experiences, your personal experiences growing up and talking about books and, some of the literature that you went through as a child, it really resonated with me. So I'm from Zimbabwe, and growing up, reading books that, mainly white background, but I was also thinking, as you were talking about this project, this participatory action project, that it's going to also have, you're also going to have another aspect of the global. So I was just curious to find out, if you have identified some of the countries, and as you were going through this, both of you going through this presentation, I was thinking, I don't even remember, of course, things have changed, even reading a book that was very environmental when I was growing up, that was in my native language of Shona. But I have heard stories like my grandmother telling the fairy tales when we visited in the rural area, talking about the rabbit who was clever and all those stories, so we could connect with the environment that way. And of course, the value of certain places that were sacred, and we would hear stories about that. So I'm just curious about, with the global aspect, have you identified some of those countries that you'll be also looking at this with this project?
Thank you so much for your transparency and your personal story. That is definitely what the mission is to do is to first the research. We've been finding that there are a lack of the oral history that was passed on from generation to generation. Some of it is just not existing now due to many things. And I would definitely love to connect with you and expound on that thought. I guess our information was in the slide, but I can definitely write the email address and my phone number for you all to reach out, because those are the things that we're finding that we just need to bring to light, and especially that rural oral history that you said that your family was able to teach you for you to connect to the environment. That's lacking in all aspects, and we didn't have time to really share a personal story, but I definitely connect to that example. Most of the oral history on my end didn't get really passed down because most of it was because it was trauma enhanced. The fears and the phobias and things like that. So we definitely will be aiming towards globally and internationally trying to fill in all of these gaps. So I'm gonna put my information in the chat box.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisi. We do have a couple questions showing up in the chat. Question for Lisi and Meredith. If there's, what are some of the biggest openings, institutional, policy, et cetera, for expanding literacy, both to address the gaps and include climate justice?
I don't know if you want to take this one, but yeah, I would say that there's probably so many places to start that we're actually, already having people and programs coming to us saying, hey, the nonprofit's just now getting going, but can you already come and consult with our groups, our programs? So yeah, I think part of it is we can just start as local as possible, but also expand globally. And it just depends on the people that we're able to network with and our partner with internationally as well. So I would say that, we're still at sort of a ground basis of a research phase, trying to figure those pieces out of what already exists, because there is really some good literacy out there, but we just need to make it more available. And other times the content may be there, but it may not at all be representative. So we want to make it more diverse.
If I may, one of the initiatives that the International Baccalaureate program at, there's one at Grimsley and there's several throughout the state. The curricula for this program, and I say curricula because it's multidisciplinary, they have added an environmental theme, and within that environmental theme, of course, they're looking at climate change. And I would think the presentation that the two of you gave today would be something that the Grimsley IB program, for example, would love to hear. I can put you in contact with a faculty person who handles their environmental thematic, if you'd like.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
You bet.
And we had another comment. I don't know, Morgan, if you want to expand on this, but you asked how to balance in an era of climate change-induced migration, the adaptive strategy of disassociating from a place to being able to form connections in a new place. Mm-hmm. I think Steve touched on that a bit, and I know just from the research and reading I've done just to stay in touch with these things, I think the United States in particular, we're dealing with sea level rise in Miami, Richmond, Charleston, all along the east, the coastlines everywhere. And it becomes a question of, do we spend $10 million to help a half a dozen or so families in a coast, or do we spend that money to build a dike outside of Richmond where there's a massive military, installation? And, you know, those are some really serious questions, and maybe Steve can answer a little bit more about. That's not really relating to what you were asking, Morgan. I think you're talking about more about the personal experience, but yeah, I think it's really tough when people aren't being involved in these types of decisions of what our legislature is, the decisions our legislatures are making.
I might venture to answer a little bit here as well from my work with resettlement with refugees and immigrant populations who many have been displaced related to climate justice issues. And that may be as simple as an economic problem that they couldn't afford, you know, to sustain life there, and they had to migrate, and they didn't necessarily see it related to climate justice, but what was the reason behind why they need, you know, couldn't sustain things on their own land there related to the environment. So just helping people understand those connections to climate degradation or toxins or whatever the case may be, or the potential of wars for breaking out over natural resources, and then people are being displaced, as well as the natural disasters with the flooding or the hurricanes and such, or the fires that we see. I think another piece of it is the, you know, that we touched on in one of the slides that I think Lisi mentioned was the way that people are positioned to begin with. That's a climate injustice. That the land that they are already on and then being displaced from was even sort of maybe not the most ideal. It was the most risk prone, the most hazardous to begin with. And that was what they were relegated to begin with, versus having access to even more safe areas. So even from the beginning, there were injustices involved in that. And then I would speak to Morgan's question more specifically about how to connect in the new place. That's a lot of the research that I've been doing with my students related to the Climates of Inequality project from the Humanities Action Lab with both LeeCee and Steve. And we've been looking at interviewing people who have migrated into North Carolina, into Greensboro area, specifically looking at what were those push factors and what did they appreciate about and felt connected to in their original environments, as well as now that they've relocated, what are, you know, some environmental injustices that they're facing that we can help address at a community level, as well as what are some of the things that they really enjoy in their new places. And so some of it might be wanting to, you know, have a small garden plot outside of their apartment complex so that they can grow vegetables that are native to their own cultures. It could be that simple, but then having to work with the housing, you know, policies at the apartment complex to make that possible. It may be having access to safe outdoor spaces, not necessarily, you know, broken and trash-filled playgrounds in their, you know, environment, in the lack of affordable housing in environments here in Greensboro. So helping them to make connections to place, especially if they came from areas of origin where they were outdoors a lot, connected to nature more, and then they have that nature deficit problem where they're inside a lot for either their fear or safety issues, or the reasons that we all are sitting inside, you know, on a Zoom call, right? Rather than connecting in the more natural environments. So yeah, a lot of those pieces are being researched, but also thinking about the connections to place really relate to those ecotherapeutic ways that we are never actually disconnected from nature, but that we have to just really recognize our connections and reinstitute ways to make those more visible.
I would like to add to Meredith in echoing Steve and Meredith, the voice of the community, the voice of the people, and the ones that are experiencing, you know, these traumatic incidences versus it being the land that was given, that they built on, and then being, you know, removing from that area. Some of them are fighting to be relocated because it was already hazardous or less of the land that you want to live on anyway. But giving them the voice, I think Steve talked about it in his presentation, you know, the matter of the fact of just looking at it, look and see, you know, would you want to live here? You know, some on the other side of it, in regards to relocation, giving them a voice, letting them have agency about the structure, about the connection, about the community, and where the government is finally may give them money to resettle.
If you know, I wanted to follow up real quick on Meredith and LeeCee's kind of plug for music, which I really appreciate you guys putting in. It doesn't get normally put on the table at all, so I'm grateful as a musicologist. But you know, and not to even downplay the importance of the government or some of the bigger kind of regional or statewide issues, but to bring it really local to UNCG and think about that placemaking for resettled and relocated people to Greensboro. UNCG, you know, has this phenomenal school of music that has all of these resources, and the resources would take those statistics that you guys provided about the children's books and push it even further over to that white category. Right, and it's been a real problem for a long time. The School of Music doesn't reflect the makeup of our student body. It doesn't reflect the makeup of our community. It's very, you know, the curricula, it doesn't reflect any of this stuff. And there have been some small attempts by those of us in the School of Music who really want to be more inclusive, to engage communities and help those resettled communities here share their culture with our students, but also share it with each other and have opportunities to reconnect and rebuild that sense of place. And it's been a very, I mean, it's been very minimal in terms of the overall aspect of what the School of Music does, and reflects the very problematic skewing of the faculty and of the student body and of the curriculum. And it's one of these ways that, you know, the institution is furthering the systemic problems on this very local level when it could be part of the solutions. And so there are other ways. I mean, we could talk about this with all kinds of other cultural products. Music is one of those really wonderful things, though, that can really help people connect around shared culture and places, depending on the situation, and where our local institutions could help, and in fact are part of the problem more than part of the solution. So I just wanted to throw that in there as a kind of wrinkle in the ointment, but also to thank you guys for bringing up music and putting that on the table. So thanks.
If I could follow up with music, the sculpture focus thematic in the School of Art, been in touch with those folks, and we're the end of this semester, when I've got a little bit more time, going to put in a Mellon grant to the Mellon Foundation, which is funding statuary that has historic significance to it. So was talking with Bobby Jones, the mayor of Princeville, and Linda Joyner, and Lisi will be a part of this discussion as well, about the possibility of getting some funding and getting the sculpture people involved and producing a statue of Turner Prince, who is the person that Princeville is named after. There's no photograph of him. There's really very little known about him. Calvin Adkins from Princeville has done some work around this, but the statue could be put together in such a way that it honors this man who built some of the first houses in Princeville, or was part of, he was a classic carpenter, helped build the houses in Princeville. He also took care of a lot of the antebellum homes in Tarboro. So we're starting that and getting the sculpture people involved.
It's great news.
I had one last thing to share, if I may. My screen here, this is something that I was thinking about ecotherapy, and as Aaron was sharing, and now Steve, I love this quote, the idea of before the guitar was an instrument, it was a tree and the birds sang in it. The wood knew about music long before becoming an instrument. I really love that idea that as we connect with instruments, we're also reconnecting with nature and creating healing in ourselves and in the world.
Yeah. Wow. Legendary.
That's
All
my
right.
rough translation from
Or
Spanish.
don't get me started, because the way that I mean, no, and I agree with that entirely. I've written articles about the very thing, and it's basically 99% of musicians have never thought about that tree. And when I give my talks about violins and trees, I get musicians who are like, "Wow, I played this violin for 50 years and I never once thought about the tree it came from." It's this classic disassociation of humans and nature. So anyway, there's possibility there. It's often not realized because of these institutional structures that have taught other ways of being. So thanks for bringing that up though, Meredith.
Yeah. And that's that shift again from an anthropocentric worldview to this eco-social worldview. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end. I really appreciate everybody coming out. Thank you to our guest lecturers today. Another informative session. Thank you to my co-host, Dr. Kanafuchi. I will be posting the video up onto YouTube, and we have all of our other lectures up there as well. And I will send a notification to everyone via email when that's available. Look for it in about a week or so. And we do have other talks in the works. We're going to be focusing on hopefully organizing a talk with some grad students about people of color engaging in outdoors and reconnecting with the outdoors. And then ETSCO, we're going to be doing a focus on food subjects as well, and food justice.
Yes,
and
veganism.
Yep. That one will be in March, and we're hoping to get the one about people of color and their relationship with outdoors by the end of February up and running. So look for those. Follow us on social media at Sustainable UNCG, and I hope everyone has a warm and dry weekend. Y'all take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.